Now the first thing we're going to do is just load in one of our plants that we'd like to edit. And we're going to select a tree since we designed leaves for a tree. It doesn't really matter which one we select, depending. The coconut tree is a little bit different type of leaf. That's more similar to a way a plant is created. Same thing with the Mexican palm. But most of these we can end up using that material for, and we can get different effects off of each one of these different trees. So the first one we're going to take a look at is our plum tree. And we're just going to modify our image map to reflect what we have created in Photoshop. So I'm going to double click on our material, or on our plant, to pull up our plant editor. And we're just do a really quick swap out of our textures in here. We just select our leaf, and then we can load in our color and our alpha picture. So we just click this little arrow, and then we can load in our color map. And then we're going to come down here to our alpha, and we're going to select our clip that we created. And now we already have our leaves changed on our tree. There's more things we want to do to it. We want to go into our advanced material editor and edit that a little bit. We're also going to change our trunk. But first, let's take a look at a render, just a quick render of what this already looks like. So I'm going to do a final render, render to screen, and do 800 by 600. We'll just let that render. And you can see we already have a very interesting looking tree already. We can see all the new foliage that we created, and it works quite well with the plum tree. But let's go ahead and change this up just a little bit more, and we'll link our bump maps and our luminosity maps and make it look even better. So we want to make sure our leaf layer is selected. We're going to double click and open up our advanced material editor. And now we can just go into our function editor to pretty much finish off the texture. First thing I want to do is delete the bump that is default on these leaves already. And I'm going to select our bump. We're going to go over here to add a texture map node. And you can see that it's already adding a texture map from our transparency. What we could do is just swap that out. So we're going to go down here, our arrow. And we want to make sure we're using our bump. So we're going to select our bump map. And I'm not going to worry about the bump scale just yet, or the amount, and we'll take a look at that once we get out of the function editor. But now what we want to do is adjust our highlight, pretty much our specularity. So what we can do is select our highlight, and we're going to add a texture map node again, and then we can swap that out with the specularity map that we created. And I'm going to click OK. And we're going to go to our highlights, and we can increase the brightness to match up with what we have for our variable highlight, and then how dull or shiny we want it. And then we'll take a look at our bump, and it's at 0.5 right now, which might be enough. I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 0.7, and we'll take a look at a render for that. And we can see our bump map has been applied, and we can see where the areas divot on our leaves, and we'll zoom in a little bit closer later to get a better render of that. But we can also see the specularity and a little bit of the shininess on our leaves now, and also our bump map affecting that. We'll of course adjust that a little bit later. But one thing we notice overall is it still doesn't look very realistic. Our leaves are a little too dark, and that's one thing, is leaves are translucent. They're not transparent, but they're translucent, and it's a little difficult to edit this within view. We don't use translucency like you think. This is for subsurface scattering. But what we can actually do is fake it by using luminosity. So I'm going to select our drive with function for our luminosity on these leaves. And I'm going to delete the constant number that's attached to it. And we're going to add another texture map node. I want to change this to flat vertical so that we're matched up with the rest of them. And since we haven't made any changes at all to our scale, we don't have to worry about making any other changes. I'm going to go ahead and just load in our specular map that we created, which will work just as well because we have black on our branches, and then the leaves are just a little bit lighter. So that way we'll just have our leaves with that luminosity. But the only problem is we have really no way of adjusting our luminosity once we have this texture map on. And if I go ahead and click OK right now, we're going to notice that our leaves are a little bit too bright. So we want to be able to adjust that. We're going to go back into our function editor, and then we can add a filter node to that to change it. So we're going to select our line that connects our luminosity to our projected map, and I'm just going to add a filter node. And all we have to do now is edit this filter, and we can take our right point and just drag that down, and this is going to be our percentage between 0 and 100. So the brightest amount and not bright at all, and we can kind of bring it in between if we want, and just sort of adjust that to get the luminosity that we're looking for. So we'll click OK, and let's go ahead and render that out, and we can see that our leaves are a little bit brighter. And we've removed most of the dark shadowed areas that we had. If we increase the luminosity a little bit more, we'll get brighter leaves and start to make those areas, of course, a little bit brighter. And a lot of that also has to depend on global illumination or what lighting setting you're using as well. So you want to go back and forth and check and see what's going to look best for an overall scene. And what I also want to do now is adjust our trunk, because we want our trunk to match up with the bark that we created for our texture. So we're going to go to our bark texture, and double click on that, and we're going to go to our function editor for this. And we're pretty much just going to clear it all out. So we're just going to select all our nodes and delete them. And then we're going to use color, and I'm going to add that texture map, and we're going to load in. I'm going to be using that same bark texture that we had before. So I'm going to use number 69 and click OK. And what we can also do is link this directly to our bump as well if we wanted. But I just want to take a look at scaling right now. So I'm going to click OK before I adjust anything else. And we're going to see what our scale looks like on this trunk. And I'll just render that really quick. And we can tell immediately that our texture is way too small because we have a lot of these repetitions in here. So we need to make a few changes. I'm going to go back into our function editor, and we can adjust our scale. So I can bring this up to 2 by 2, which will double our size. Click OK. And I also want to make sure that we're using, let's just use faces, which in this case is going to be best for these branches. Cylindrical is going to cause a few errors here and there. And we might even need to scale this up a little bit larger. 2 might not be enough. We'll go ahead and take a look. And it looks like it's still a little too low, so we're going to go ahead and double that once again. Turn that to 4 for the image scale. And that should be more than enough. So now we're going to edit the function for the bump, because we want to have a little bit of depth in there. And what we can actually just do is select our bump and move it over the highlighted area. And once we let go, this little pop-up comes up, and it's going to ask us if we'd like to select a grayscale or alpha output. We're going to select the grayscale and click OK. And then we can adjust our bump overall in the main window without having to go into the function editor. And we're still using the same image, and image size is all linked to that other node. So if we want to increase our bump, we just have to do it right here, and we don't have to worry about going back into the function editor. And let's go ahead and render that with our bump map and our higher size and see if any adjustments need to be made. And we can tell the bump map looks pretty good. It's not too deep, so we don't have to worry about adjusting that. We can see that we have a little bit of mirroring right down the center of our material, where it's just using the same texture on both sides. And like I said, changing that back and forth between cylindrical, faces, and flat vertical. We could also use a couple of other different methods for this. But if you wanted to change that, you easily could, if that was maybe a little bit too distracting or a little too obvious. I'm going to zoom out, and we actually probably won't be able to see that on our bark at all once we render from farther away. But that really depends on how close up you are going to be to that tree. So we'll go ahead and just render this again. And now from far away, the render, you can barely even tell that that's being mirrored over, and it looks really good. Our bump looks nice and consistent from far away, because that's another thing to keep in mind is as you zoom in to your plants, they look a little bit different sometimes. So you want to keep a good average amount between the two, unless you're going to have some that are used specifically for close-ups and some that are for farther away shots. Another thing that will help too is reducing maybe your texture amounts on some of these different things to improve that. And now what I want to do is take a little bit closer look at those leaves. So we're going to render and get our camera zoomed in a little bit further and do a quick render of mostly just our leaves so we can take a look and see if we need to make any adjustments to our bump map or specularity. And now that we're a little bit closer to the leaves, we can see there's a lot of distortion in our bump map on these leaves. So what we need to do is go back into our material editor for our leaves, and we are going to edit the function. We'll just pull that up, and we're going to take a look at our bump, and we want to make sure that our interpolation type is set to at least bilinear, which should improve the quality of that render by quite a bit and start to smooth out that texture a little bit more. Because what the filtering does is it allows us to adjust low resolution images so it doesn't look too bad. We'll go ahead and render that out, and we can see the difference. And we can tell that that helped a little, but not quite enough. So what we're going to need to do is reduce our bump map depth just a little on the leaves. So we'll go back into that material, and our bump is set to 0.7 on our leaves. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to 0.35 and click OK. And I'm going to re-render, and we'll take a look at the change. And that did remove some of our darker spots that we had on there, but we can still see that we overall have a lot of turbulence within and a lot of noise within that material. So one thing we could do is actually go back into Photoshop, and we could use the Gaussian blur just a little bit more. Another thing you could do is, if you're going to be working with higher res maps, is actually increase the overall map that you created. Instead of working with something that's 2000 by 2000, you could start out a little bit higher, maybe 4000 or 5000 by 5000, and that'll improve the quality of the render. For this, being far away, it should be alright. So if we select our camera and just kind of move out, we're not going to notice that those little artifacts at all from this far away. But of course, as we're closer, we will notice that. So if we do need to make that sort of change, and we can go and blur that up a little bit more, or we can create a different type of bump map, maybe do it manually and not just using our color map. So there's a lot of different ways we could modify that and make it a little bit better. But overall, the texturing on our tree is completely done. So now what we could do if we wanted to is we could go ahead and save this out. And what we want to do is create a new plant species. We want to make sure, if we're going to save this, that we don't just save out the plant, because what that will do is just create this one specific plant. But if we save this out as a plant species, then it will load up every single time with these materials on there, and of course give us our variations that we want. And while we're still in here, what we can do is create new plant if we wanted, and all these materials will still be applied, and it'll go through the solid growth and all the different variations that it's creating and that we can create by using our new species, because basically we have an entirely new tree now. And I could adjust the diameter if I wanted, maybe make that trunk a little bit thicker, a little more interesting. We could reduce that droop or increase it, and pretty much customize this however it is we want. So we don't have to worry about just changing texture maps. We also have to take a look at some of these other settings. But since it's solid growth, we don't have to worry about using this in a scene and having it just be the same tree over and over and over. So by modifying our plants within solid growth, it gives us a lot of extra flexibility. So I'm just going to go ahead and render this out now with our new changes, and we'll take a look at that. And now what we end up with is a very neat looking tree. And of course we can customize this more. If we wanted to go into the plant editor, we can adjust the length of the leaves and the width. And on trees, you want to pretty much adjust these equally, at least for the most part, since it is based on a square and not so much one specific leaf. We have several different leaves, so we don't want to stretch out our material too much. But we could, of course, adjust the randomness and anything else like any other type of tree and get an entirely different type of effect. And then if we want, we can go ahead and try this out on a different tree. So let's load in another type of tree. And in this, we could actually even use the winter pear tree, even though if we take a look at it, it doesn't look like there's any leaves on there. But these branches are actually being created the same way that our leaves are being created. And that is just based on an image map, so we could adjust that as well. I'm going to grab our fall cherry tree and click OK. We'll let that load in. I'm just going to move that over to the side. And I'm just going to copy our leaves from our plum tree. Copy material, and then we'll just paste that on the leaves for our cherry tree. And now we have a cherry tree model with our new leaves on it. And we could, of course, just adjust the bark. And with our cherry tree, as I was explaining before, we have not a lot of leaves creating that texture map. So with our new texture map, it's a lot more dense, and we've got a lot more leaves in there, so you might need to do a little more adjusting. Maybe reduce your length and your width. You can do that. I'll thin out our tree just a little tiny bit. And we'll go ahead and just take a render of that and see how that looks. And you can really see the overall density changes between the two trees. This one we have a lot smaller leaves. Our texture is being made a lot smaller, and there's a lot more of them. So we have a lot of increased density, but it looks really good. Like I said, it's not maybe a real tree, but that's the beauty of 3D, is we can create whatever we want. Another thing we might also want to do is move that trunk over, because we can see with our branches that we have from our image map, they're a lot darker and entirely different than our base trunk. So we'll go ahead to our plum tree, and we can copy the trunk, go to our cherry tree, and paste onto our trunk. And I'm just going to frame that and give it a render. So now we've created pretty much the exact same tree, the same set of leaves, same set of bark, but we end up with an entirely different tree. So as we apply this to different types of trees, we will see that our material and the overall effects of that material will change what it looks like, and quite drastically sometimes. And another thing we can do too, as far as saving these materials, is instead of actually saving the species of tree, because let's say we have a very versatile texture that we've created and we can apply it to anything, so we might as well just save the actual textures out, and then we can apply them to other materials. So to do that, all we really need to do is right mouse click on this texture, we can grab our leaves, and we can just click Save Material. And then we can save that to wherever we want, and then if we ever want to load in that tree we just created, or these leaves that we created on any other type of tree, instead of loading in the species and copying and pasting or redoing the entire texture maps, we could just save out that set of texture and put it on anything. And now I'm just going to apply this to one last tree, a little bit of a different type of tree, our fir tree. And our fir tree is actually generated by one specific leaf, but we can actually get a really neat effect by using this new material on this plant. So I'm just going to go to our plum tree, and we can copy our material, select our fir tree, make sure we go to our plant or our actual leaves, and paste that material. And then we're also going to go into the plant editor and adjust where the leaves are being created, because we could set this to right here and get an entirely different type of tree and the way it's structured. If we go back and change our starting point to the center, it will change our tree up a little bit differently. And then what we could also do is adjust our length, maybe our diameter. We could droop this a little bit, zoom out, and also decrease our length and our width. And we just have these little bits of our leaves showing in here and there. I'm going to create and cycle through so we can see all the different variations that we can create from that. We'll click OK. And I might as well just use the same bark texture that we had for the other ones. We can copy that material, and then we can paste it on the trunk of our fir tree. And I'll just go ahead and render that out, and we can see an entirely new tree we've created. And we can see that's pretty neat looking. And we could, of course, customize a specific material for this if we wanted to, and have specific type of leaves on there. But right now, even with this, it looks pretty interesting and kind of neat. So we could go ahead and customize this tree all we wanted. And so the best thing to do is just go ahead and try it out with different trees, different species, because you'll get different effects from every single type of tree. And sometimes you'll even find that the branches you created for one species of tree actually look better on another. So it's always a good idea to play around with it and switch back and forth.